So we have these bones at our nape of the neck resembling these slingshots. These are the typical cervical vertebrae ranging from C3 to C6. We'll take a look at their general features, the attachments, and the foraminas associated with it. So let's get started with the first part, which is the body. Again, making things interesting for you, let's place these shapes in place. I think this rectangle fits here, and it's the body of the cervical vertebrae. This triangle is a perfect fit for the vertebral foramen. And these two tiny circles would go here at the foramen transversarium. That's super easy, ain't it? Coming to the peculiar features of the body, it has four surfaces: anterior, posterior, superior, and underneath we have the inferior surface. The superior surface is boat-shaped with these projecting lips on either side, with the bevelment on the anterior border. Now coming to the saddle-shaped inferior surface, which is basically making a joint with the preceding vertebral lips. The type of joint present would be of a synovial variety. If you observe closely, this anterior border is elongated, projecting downwards to hide the preceding vertebrae. The anterior and the posterior surfaces resemble those of the other vertebrae. Body is placed anteriorly and the spine is placed posteriorly to the vertebral foramen. Moving on to the features of the vertebral foramen. One important thing to notice is the size of the vertebral foramen, which is larger than the body. Again, as we observed, it's triangular in shape because of the pedicles that are directed backwards and laterally. The superior and the inferior vertebral notches are of equal size as shown here. Now focus on the vertebral arch. This V-shaped is formed by the lamina fusing in the midline and then extending posteriorly into a spine. If you observe closely, the lamina are relatively long and narrow, being thinner superiorly than inferiorly. The superior and inferior articular facets are forming pillars in the midline and joining the lamina and the pedicle. One unique feature of the transverse process is that it has a foramen transversarium. These processes end up into anterior and posterior roots, and finally into anterior and posterior tubercles. These tubercles are joined by the costotransverse bar. Let me tell you an interesting fact that the anterior tubercle of the 6 cervical vertebrae is large, which is known as the carotid tubercle, because the common carotid artery can be felt here. Note the two-legged appearance as noted here in the spine, which is bifid in case of cervical vertebrae. This accommodates the ligamentum nuchae, which is basically a stabilizing ligament posteriorly holding the vertebral column together. The anterior and the posterior longitudinal ligament gets attached to the body throughout its length anteriorly and posteriorly. On each side of the anterior longitudinal ligament, the vertical part of the longus colli is attached to the anterior surface. The anterior tubercle gives attachment to the scalenus anterior, the longus capitis, and the oblique part of the longus colli. The posterior tubercle gives attachments to the scalenus medius, scalenus posterior, the levator scapulae, the splenius cervicis, the longissimus cervicus, and the iliocostalis cervicis. The spine gives origin to the deep muscles of the nape of the neck, namely interspinalis, semispinalis thoracis, and spinalis cervicis, and multifidus. If you notice, the longus colli has two attachments on this vertebrae. The anterior surface has the attachment of the vertical part of the longus colli, and the oblique part is attached to the anterior tubercle. The cervical vertebra have the foramen transversaria, which basically is a typical feature to the cervical vertebra. The foramen transversarium allows the passage of vertebral artery, vertebral veins, and a branch of the inferior cervical ganglion. So these are the features of a typical cervical vertebrae which will help you identify it. And now I'll move on to the atypical variety, that is the C1, C2, and C7 vertebrae.